The sun rose over the Bosphorus from the east. Its golden rays glided over the domes of Hagia Sophia, reflected in the water, and it seemed that the city was living its usual life. But in those last weeks of spring 1453, Constantinople was already living like a doomed city. Its walls, once impregnable, were now scarred by artillery shells. There were not enough ships in the ports, not enough bread in the markets, and people's hearts were gripped by fear of the storm that was about to break. Constantine XI, Palaiologos, the last emperor of Rome, sat on the throne. His opponent was the young Sultan Mehmed II, who was only 21 years old, but whose determination and ambition exceeded the size of his empire. This duel was not just a struggle between states, it was a clash of worlds, civilizations, and eras. By the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former power. Once its land stretched from Italy to Syria, but now it was reduced to Constantinople itself, a handful of villages in the surrounding area, and a few islands. The city, once home to hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, now had a population of only about 50,000. The narrow streets were overgrown with grass, the marble squares were empty, and many palaces lay in ruins. But the city walls still commanded respect. The three-tiered fortifications, built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius, were considered impregnable. Thousands of attacking armies throughout history had crashed against them like waves against rocks. The inhabitants believed that the Virgin Mary protected their city. They prayed day and night in the monasteries, but at the same time, everyone understood that if the Turks broke through, no miracle would save them. Mehmed II ascended the throne in 1451. He was 21 years old, but he had been raised as a conqueror since childhood. His tutors taught him Greek, Latin, military tactics, and engineering. He passionately studied the history of Rome and dreamed of surpassing Caesar and Alexander. The Sultan saw Constantinople not only as a city, he saw it as a symbol. As long as the Byzantine capital stood, it reminded the world that the Ottomans were only successors, not masters. By taking Constantinople, he would turn it into a new capital and open the way to domination of the Eastern Mediterranean. He began preparing for the siege in advance. The Rumeli Hisar fortress was built on the banks of the Bosphorus to cut off the route of aid from the Black Sea. He had at his disposal the latest weapons, huge bombards created by the Hungarian engineer Urban. One cannonball weighed over half a ton. In the spring of 1453, the Sultan's army crossed the Bosphorus. Historians estimate its size differently, from 80 to 120,000 people. Against them, no more than 7,000 defenders remained in the city, including mercenaries from Genoa and Venice. On April 6, 1453, the ground beneath the walls of Constantinople shook from the march of the Ottoman army. Hundreds of tents covered the plain, and colorful banners fluttered in the wind. Turkish horsemen, janissaries in white turbans, sipahis in chain mail, and teams of sappers with shovels and axes. It all seemed like an endless stream. Mehmed II took up position on a hill from which he could see the entire city. From here, he could see the domes of Hagia Sophia and the long lines of walls. He ordered the digging of trenches, the setting up of batteries, and the construction of siege towers. Soon, a rumble spread across the plain. The bombards had begun their work. Each cannonball, striking the stone, left a crack, a cloud of dust, and a ringing in the ears. The inhabitants of the city gathered in the squares. Many saw fireballs flying through the sky for the first time and fell prostrate, praying for salvation. But Emperor Constantine the 11th ordered them to remain calm. He himself went out onto the walls, talked to the soldiers, and showed that he was not afraid. Inside Constantinople, life turned into a constant wait for the blow. The laughter of children was not heard in the streets. Women prayed in temples. Men stood guard on the walls. At night, people fell asleep to the sound of Ottoman drums and woke up to the sound of stone cannonballs. Supplies were quickly dwindling. Bread was baked from flour mixed with bark and weed seeds. Water had to be conserved. The wells could not meet the demand. Even dogs and cats were sold in the markets, and prices rose daily. And yet, the city held out. Italian mercenaries, especially the detachment of Giustiniani Longo from Genoa, defended it with remarkable steadfastness. They reinforced the damaged walls with sacks of earth and barrels, and at night, by torchlight, they repaired the breaches with lime and stone. The emperor himself took part in the work. He was seen in the mud, pickaxe in hand. For the inhabitants, this was a sign. The king has not abandoned us. The Ottomans tried to storm the walls. On April 18th, the first major assault took place. To the sound of drums, the Janissaries rushed towards the breaches. They were covered by huge wooden towers and shields, behind which the sappers moved. Arrows rained down on the heads of the defenders, and hooks with ropes struck the walls. But the Byzantines and Genoese repelled the attack. Burning logs, stones, tar, and boiling water poured down on the attackers' heads. Crossbows and arquebuses struck the attackers at close range. Hundreds of bodies remained at the foot of the walls. Despite heavy losses, the Turkish army continued to advance. Each new cannonball destroyed an old stone, and behind every crack stood the certainty that the walls could not last forever. Week after week, the city lived under the roar of cannons. People began to get used to death as part of everyday life. Children stopped crying when they heard explosions. Old people quietly died of hunger and were buried at night in gardens because the cemeteries were already overcrowded. And yet, hope remained. The inhabitants believed that the Western powers would come to their aid. Envoys sought help from the Pope, Venice, and Genoa, but time passed, and not a single fleet appeared on the horizon. The emperor said, "Even if help does not come, we will die as warriors." These words were passed from mouth to mouth. By May 1453, the Ottoman artillery strikes were getting stronger. Urban's main bombard rumbled so loudly that the earth shook. Each cannonball left holes in the walls as wide as a man. The defenders rushed to patch up the breaches, but the stone no longer held as firmly as before. The Sultan ordered almost non-stop firing. Thousands of mules and dozens of oxen pulled cannonballs and gunpowder from the camp to the batteries. The workers did not have time to cool the barrels, and the guns sometimes exploded, killing their own artillerymen. But the flow of iron and stone did not stop. The city hummed like a bell from morning till night. People stopped talking in the markets. No one could hear each other over the roar of the cannons. Mehmed understood that as long as the Byzantine fleet controlled the Golden Horn, the chances of success were slim. A huge chain stretched between the towers prevented the Sultan's ships from entering the harbor. Then he decided on a bold move. On April 22nd, his soldiers laid wooden planks across the Galata hills and, after greasing the logs with lard, dragged dozens of ships overland. At dawn, the city's inhabitants saw Turkish galleys standing in the Golden Horn. This moment became a turning point. Now the Ottoman artillery was firing at the walls from two sides, and the Byzantines could not completely cover all areas of defense. Disputes began in the city. Some demanded to continue the resistance to the end, while others proposed negotiations. The Venetians persuaded the emperor to surrender on certain terms. But Constantine XI said, "The city has been entrusted to us by God. I cannot abandon it. Better to die on the walls than to sign a shameful peace treaty." These words spread throughout the city, and many took them as an oath. But anxiety grew in everyone's hearts. How long could they stand against an entire army? On May 28, 1453, the sun set over Constantinople for the last time as the capital of Byzantium. In the evening, a religious procession passed through the streets of the city. Priests carried icons, the choir sang ancient hymns, and even the enemies on the walls heard the murmur of prayers. Emperor Constantine XI took communion with his soldiers in Hagia Sophia. Then he climbed onto the walls and said, "My brothers, today we will die or we will win. I am with you." People did not sleep that night. Some cried in the arms of their families, others sharpened their swords. Sailors reinforced the gates, carpenters hammered boards into the breaches. The fires of the Ottoman camp burned in the sky, and it was clear that dawn would bring the final blow. The dawn of May 29th began with the roar of drums. Thousands of janissaries advanced, wave after wave. The first attacks were repelled, but the walls were already cracking. Hand-to-hand combat broke out in the breaches. The Genoese commander Giustiniani was seriously wounded by a cannonball and left the walls. This was a disaster. Many defenders thought all was lost and fled. Emperor Constantine XI took off his purple cloak so as not to stand out and rushed into battle with the ordinary soldiers. No one saw him again. Later, it was said that he died at the gates of St. Romanus, fighting to the end. By noon, the Ottomans had broken into the city. The Sultan's banners were raised above the towers. Soldiers poured into the square, and residents fled to churches, hoping to find refuge there. Sultan Mehmed rode into the city on a white horse. He stopped at Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and ordered the temple to be converted into a mosque. "Now, Constantinople is mine," he said. The city had fallen. With it, the 1,000-year history of the Eastern Roman Empire came to an end. For some, it was a fall. For others, the beginning of a new era. From then on, Constantinople became Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The last weeks of the siege turned Constantinople into a living wound. Streams of dirty water mixed with ashes flowed through the narrow streets. Destroyed houses gaped with empty windows. Shops had long since closed, and workshops, where the sound of hammers once rang out, had now been turned into warehouses for weapons and food. Candles burned around the clock in the temples. People came there to pray and share their last reserves of food. Women spun worn fabrics and sewed bandages from them, preparing for a new wave of wounded. The warriors lived on the walls. Their daily routine consisted of endless guard duty and work to reinforce the breaches. They slept on stones, covered with cloaks, eating dry bread and rare portions of beans. Many had not washed for a long time. Their beards were covered in soot and dust, but their eyes remained firm. The Byzantines used everything they had at their disposal. They still had old catapults that hurled stones and burning vessels filled with oil. Crossbowmen and arquebusiers took up positions on the towers, firing volleys at the Turkish assault troops. Even hunting bows and spears forged in haste by blacksmiths were put to use. The Turks, on the other hand, had modern weapons. Their artillery included dozens of bombards of various calibers, from light ones to Urban's giants. They built siege towers covered with leather to protect the wood from fire. Sappers dug under the walls, trying to lay mines and blow up the fortifications. The battle on the walls was fought not only with weapons, but also with bare hands. People clashed face to face. Shields broke, swords slid along chainmail, spears clattered against armor. Every meter of the wall cost dozens of lives. The most terrible enemy was not the sword or the cannonball, but hunger. Grain reserves were running out, and the inhabitants cooked soups from herbs and roots. Horses that were not killed in battle became food for the rich. The poor ate pigeons and dogs. Diseases began to spread. Plague and dysentery spread in cramped basements and towers. Doctors did everything they could. They performed bloodletting and prepared decoctions of garlic and vinegar. But dozens of people died every day. They were buried at night so as not to demoralize the rest. And yet, the city did not surrender. Each new day was a victory, small, perhaps, but a victory over fate. Constantinople waited for help from the West. Envoys sent letters to Pope Nicholas V, to the Venetians, to the Genoese. Fleets were indeed being assembled, but too slowly. Italian cities traded with the Ottomans and were in no hurry to sacrifice their interests. Rumors spread throughout the city. The Pope has already sent ships. Venice is close. But every day the sea remained empty. Only a few Venetian and Genoese ships managed to break through the blockade. Too few to change the outcome. The inhabitants realized they had been abandoned. Europe watched, but did not intervene. On the eve of the decisive assault, Constantine XI gathered his soldiers in Hagia Sophia. The golden mosaics shone in the light of the torches, and in their glow the soldiers' faces seemed almost holy. The emperor spoke calmly. "We are the last heirs of Rome. Today, God is watching us. I will not order anyone to die, but I ask you, fight for your faith, for your families, for our city." After these words, many wept, many kissed the marble columns as if saying goodbye to their home. On May 29th, the Turkish army advanced in 3 waves. First came the irregular troops to wear down the defenders. Then came the Sipahis and Janissaries. The Sultan's best troops were the last to advance. The earth shook. Thousands of drums beat in unison. Red banners fluttered above the heads of the warriors. A fierce battle raged on the walls. The Byzantines fought back with spears, threw stones, and poured tar. But the forces were unequal. When Justinian, wounded in the chest, left the wall, the spirit of defense collapsed. The emperor disappeared into the thick of battle. No one saw his death, but later it was said that he had removed the symbols of imperial power and died with a sword in his hands. When the Turks broke into the city, the massacre began. The warriors killed everyone in their path, looted houses, and took women and children away. Hagia Sophia was filled with thousands of refugees, but soon the Janissaries broke in, and the temple was turned into a camp for the victors. Bodies lay in the streets, and the smell of smoke and blood hung in the air. For 3 days, the city was given over to looting. Such was the custom of war. On the fourth day, Sultan Mehmed entered the city. Seeing Hagia Sophia, he dismounted from his horse, took a handful of earth and sprinkled it on his head, a sign of humility before Allah. He ordered the massacre to stop and declared, "From this day forward, Constantinople is my capital." The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, was an event that forever changed the fate not only of Byzantium but of all of Europe. The city, which had existed for more than 1,000 years as the Eastern Rome, fell, and with it, the unbroken thread of ancient imperial tradition was severed. But on the ruins of one civilization, a new one immediately began to grow, the Ottoman Empire. And the consequences of that day are still felt in the 21st century. After the storming, Constantinople was given over to the Turkish army for 3 days. Such was the custom. Temples were looted, houses burned, and thousands of residents were taken into slavery. Many women and children were taken captive. Men were often sold in the slave markets of the East. Nevertheless, Sultan Mehmed II understood that if the city was empty, it would not become a capital. Within a few weeks, he began to bring life back to Constantinople. He resettled Greek prisoners and craftsmen in houses and brought Muslims, Armenians, and Jews from different parts of the empire. Thus began the new multinational Istanbul. The Sultan ordered the damaged walls to be repaired, the streets to be cleared, and he paid particular attention to Hagia Sophia. The main temple of Byzantium was converted into the Hagia Sophia Mosque. The mosaics depicting Christ and the saints were not completely destroyed. They were painted over or covered with plaster, which allowed them to survive to this day. Soon, new palaces appeared. First they began building Topkapi Palace, which became the residence of the sultans for many centuries. Nearby, madrasas, markets, and workshops sprang up. Istanbul gradually became the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The news of the fall of Constantinople shocked Europe. Pope Nicholas V declared a crusade, but the armies never set out. Genoa and Venice mourned, but at the same time calculated their losses and sought new trade routes. It was the closure of the traditional land routes to Asia via Constantinople that became one of the reasons for the great geographical discoveries. Merchants could no longer safely lead caravans through the Middle East and began to look for alternative sea routes. Just 39 years after the fall of the city, Christopher Columbus set sail westward to find a route to India. Half a century later, Vasco da Gama circumnavigated Africa and reached India by sea. Thus, the fall of Constantinople became the catalyst for a new era, an era of discovery and colonization. Hundreds of Byzantine scholars, monks, and artists fled to the West. They took with them ancient Greek and Latin manuscripts, philosophical treatises, Euclid's mathematics, and the works of Aristotle and Plato. A flood of knowledge poured into Italy, especially Florence, fueling the Renaissance. It was thanks to the Byzantine refugees that Europe remembered Plato, Euclid, and the ancient tradition. Greek began to be studied at universities, and old texts were retranslated. Thus, the fall of Byzantium marked the beginning of Europe's cultural renaissance. For the Ottoman Empire, the capture of Constantinople was a triumph. Sultan Mehmed II was given the nickname the Conqueror. Now the Ottomans had a capital that controlled the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Istanbul became the largest city in the region. The Sultanate concentrated political power, economy, and culture here. Over time, the magnificent mosques of architect Sinan, the bustling markets of the Grand Bazaar, caravanserais, and harbors through which goods from Asia, Africa, and Europe passed, appeared here. The fall of Constantinople gave rise to many myths. Among the Greeks, there was a legend that Emperor Constantine XI did not die but was transformed by an angel and would one day return to liberate the city. This belief persisted among the people for centuries. Among the Turks, there were stories that on the night after the storming, an angel descended on the walls and handed Mehmed the keys to the city, confirming his right to conquer it. To this day, May 29th is celebrated in Turkey as a day of great victory, and in Greece as a day of mourning. Constantinople fell, but its fall marked the beginning of a new world era. Byzantium perished, but its legacy, ancient books, theology, art, passed to Europe and became the foundation of the Renaissance. The Ottomans, meanwhile, built an empire on its ruins that shaped the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. It can be said that it was the fall of the city in 1453 that finally divided the Middle Ages from the modern era.